Hey, old man, is that broom the heaviest thing you've ever carried, Sergeant? Blake Thorne barked across the scorching sand, his voice brimming with the careless confidence of a young sniper who had never learned fear. The entire recon sniper platoon burst into laughter, treating the remark as casual entertainment during training hours. Walter Briggs, 82 years old, small-framed and slightly stooped, continued sweeping the scattered shell casings. The broom brushed across the dry ground, leaving behind a thin, clean line in the dust. He never looked up, not a word. Thorne stepped closer, lowering his voice into a sharper, mocking tone. You, the shooting range mascot? Standing there just for decoration. Walter stopped. For the first time, he lifted his head. His pale silver eyes were as still as a winter lake. I'm paying attention, son. The short reply made Thorne knit his brows. He grabbed the M40A6 rifle and slammed it down in front of the old man, the metal clashing sharply against the bench. Then prove it. Cold shot. 1,000 yards. Let's see if you can do anything besides sweep trash. Behind him, the younger Marines howled, raising their phones to capture what they expected to be the old man's comedy moment. Walter looked at the rifle. Then his eyes dropped to the worn leather sling attached to it, a fragment of memory from a time none of the young men here had ever lived. His expression deepened, quieted, quiet enough that a few Marines instinctively fell silent. Just as Thorne laughed again, a heavy, steady rumble rose from the distance. Engines multiple approaching the range. None of the Marines knew that this moment was about to change everything. If you believe true courage isn't found in the sound of gunfire, but in the silence of those who have walked through war, then please subscribe to Brave Veteran Stories and help us preserve the memory, dignity, and honor of the quiet heroes of our own. Walter quietly stepped away from the circle of laughter from the young Marines, still gripping the handle of his old broom. The chaotic noise of the shooting range seemed to fade behind him, leaving only the sound of wind sweeping over the thin layer of sand and a few shell casings rolling gently into each other. He stopped a short distance away, not exactly to avoid them, but as if he were protecting a private space of his own that their youth could not yet understand. His wrinkled face was worn by the sunlight tinted with time. His pale gray eyes blinked slowly, carrying the calm of someone who had seen too much loss to care about the commotion behind him. A measured breath, a distant gaze, a kind of stillness no one else on that range possessed but him. And then the memories began to stir. A dense jungle, mud wrapped around his trouser legs, the sharp, close hum of insects, the heavy breathing of a young teammate behind him trembling, but determined close enough that a slight turn of the head would touch. The smell of damp earth mixed with gunpowder. A whisper rising from the deepest corner of his memory, as if spoken only seconds ago. Did you hit him, Walt? That sound cut through layers of time and struck his chest with a painful familiarity. Walter did not answer. He had never answered that question for half a century. He had carried that silence the same way he carried the memory of the young soldier who fell during that ambush long ago. Returning to the present, his hand tightened around the broom handle. The tendons on his knuckles rose not from anger, but from a memory suddenly awakened. His silence thickened heavy enough that a few nearby Marines instinctively lowered their laughter without knowing why. Behind him, Thorne's voice continued loud and boastful, a string of sounds out of place amid the dry earth and the steady breathing of the old veteran. Walter's indifference didn't stop Thorne, but it made the others begin to look more closely. They realized the old man's silence wasn't surrender. It wasn't fear. It was as if he stood with one foot in the noisy present and the other still anchored in a past only he could see. A young corporal peeked at Walter from behind Thorne's shoulder. A slight shiver ran through him. Not because the old man seemed frightening, he didn't, but because there was something heavy inside that frail frame. Heavy like an untold story. Heavy like years of life they had not lived long enough to understand. Walter bent down and picked up a shell casing stuck under the shooting bench. The movement was slow, steady, without waste. The way his aged hand brushed the thin layer of sand from the shiny brass revealed an uncanny familiarity, like someone who had handled them thousands of times, but in a completely different setting, a different era, a different life that no one here had touched. He dropped the casing into a small bin beside him, then straightened his back. The frame that seemed fragile carried a strange weight in the air. The laughter behind him faded. An instinctive primal sense crept into the young soldiers, a sense that they had just mocked the wrong man, that this thin, stooped old figure was not someone to be made a spectacle of. Walter said nothing more, but his silence, that stillness, made the entire shooting range pause. It was as if time itself hesitated, waiting for something that was about to break the surface. And in that very moment, the humiliation began to gather, preparing to rise like the first swell of a coming storm. Sergeant Thorne stepped forward a few paces, raising his voice intentionally louder than usual to draw the entire platoon's attention. "Watch this. Grandpa's gonna break his shoulder." The words shot through the air like a sudden jolt, making the young Marines behind him all turn at once. They abandoned whatever drills they were doing and gathered into an eager line as if they were about to watch a free performance. A younger Marine with a still boyish face added sharply, "Don't sweep your pension away, old man." Laughter erupted instantly. Dry, sharp, thoughtless. The kind of laughter from men who had never carried anything heavier than the rifles in their hands. None of them noticed how each laugh fell like a small needle into the thick silence where Walter stood. Walter said nothing. He simply looked at the M40A6 lying before him. What drew his eyes was not the scope nor the sleek edges of the stock, but the old leather sling attached to it. That sling did not belong to the era of modern weapons. It was so worn it looked misplaced among the equipment of young snipers. His fingers trembled slightly as they touched the leather. One brief touch. One spark of memory opening its door. In that moment, Stone Bay faded away. In its place rose a suffocating tropical jungle. Humidity clung to every pore of his skin. Mud wrapped around each step, and beside him stood a young soldier, uniform torn from weeks of crawling and hiding, placing a new leather sling freshly traded for his last pack of cigarettes into Walter's hands. The boy smiled, his eyes glowing through the haze of drifting gun smoke. "So your rifle doesn't slip when it's wet, Walt." 2 days later, that young soldier fell in a forgotten firefight no one bothered to record. But the leather sling remained. It stayed with Walter. Stayed through decades of sleepless nights. And now it lay before him again, as if time had curled back to the deepest wound he carried. Walter closed his eyes for a single beat. Chaos intertwined the thudding of helicopter rotors from long ago, the slipping footsteps of enemy troops through mud, the ragged breath of the teammate he lost. Then it all vanished, pulling him back to the present, back to the careless laughter of boys who had never tasted war. He lifted the rifle with a motion so familiar that even the Marines watching unconsciously fell silent. No one saw an old man anymore. There was something in the way Walter held the weapon, a steadiness, an assurance, a naturalness that was unsettling. Thorne forced another laugh, but it no longer carried the same bite. Confusion flickered in his eyes as he noticed several Marines standing still now, not recording, not grinning. The mockery was still there, but it no longer ruled the air. Walter placed his hand gently on the leather sling again, like touching a sacred keepsake. His eyes opened bright but cold. That painful memory had not disappeared. It simply stood beside him like an old familiar shadow. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to straighten his back. He didn't need to declare who he was. The way he held the rifle lightly, as if welcoming a piece of his past, was enough to make several of the young Marines feel something they had never felt before, respect that could not be forced. A heavy silence spread through the air, not because Walter refused to speak, but because the young soldiers no longer knew what to say. They sensed instinctively that they had stepped across a line they did not understand, had disturbed something they were not worthy of touching. And it was in that very moment that the path to escalation began opening, as the balance of power shifted without them even realizing it. From the high watchtower overlooking the entire shooting range, Master Gunnery Sergeant Elias Van rested his elbow on the steel railing, observing with the instinct of a man who had spent years reading an opponent's character simply by the way they stood. When Walter Briggs lifted the rifle, his shoulders angled slightly. His weight shifted forward, and his feet planted into the ground, with a strange certainty. Van whispered under his breath, almost speaking to himself. "He walks like a hunter." The words slipped out purely from instinct. Not because the old man looked dangerous, but because there was something in Walter's stance that stirred memories of men who had survived nameless missions, and who never bragged, and who never misplaced a single step when placing their cheek against a rifle stock. A cold sensation crept across Van's neck. He pulled out his phone, his voice dropping low and urgent. "Check red ledger for Walter Briggs. Priority. Now." The line fell silent for a few seconds, followed by the frantic clatter of keys. Van never took his eyes off Walter, the way the old man tightened the leather sling, every movement slow, deliberate, without a trace of waste. No one sweeping a shooting range moved like that. No man doing custodial work brought a rifle to his cheek with such unnerving familiarity. At Quantico, a small room belonging to the Classified Records Division suddenly echoed with the sound of a chair hitting the floor. A silver-haired colonel with the weathered face of someone who had buried too many comrades shot to his feet as he stared at the screen. Impossible. He read the name again, each letter slicing into the scars of wars that had never fully healed. Walter Ghost, Quiet Ridge Briggs, the sniper who held off an entire enemy battalion for 72 hours during that siege. The man whispered about like a phantom. The man who had single-handedly saved dozens of young Marines when night and bullets merged into one. The colonel froze for half a heartbeat, then his voice turned into absolute command. "Get me to Stone Bay. Now." No one dared ask why. Anyone familiar with that name needed only to hear it once to know he must be there immediately. Meanwhile, back at the shooting range, Thorne grinned cruelly as he crouched down and twisted the windage knob on the rifle's scope. 2 clicks. Just enough to throw the bullet off by a full meter at 1,000 yards. "Let's see how the old man performs," Thorne muttered, struggling to suppress his own satisfied laugh. Walter didn't notice. He placed his cheek against the stock with a movement so old it felt like breathing. But instead of looking through the scope, he closed his eyes halfway. One breath down. One still moment. He felt the earth beneath his elbow. He felt the wind brushing his neck. He felt the heat shifting with the midday sun. Everything he did was simple, but simple in the way only someone who had survived moments between life and death could understand. Behind him, the laughter from the Marines continued, but it had changed. It no longer carried certainty. A few exchanged confused glances. They saw the way Walter settled into position, the way his hand reached out, as if checking the tension of the leather sling, and they could not explain it, but something in their chests whispered, "This isn't right." A young private swallowed hard and whispered to the Marine beside him, "He doesn't look like someone who just sweeps floors." No one answered. Insults were still thrown around, but they no longer landed with the same force. Something in the air was shifting slowly, but unmistakably dragging their earlier arrogance with it. Walter opened his eyes. His gaze cut through the faint haze of dust, fixed straight on the target 1,000 yards away, despite the fact he had never looked through the scope. Those eyes weren't looking at the target, they were looking into memory, into a place where life and death once shared a single breath. A young corporal murmured under his breath, I think we should stop." But his words were swallowed by Thorne's loud laugh, the laugh of a man unaware of the cold ripples spreading outward from the very man he was mocking. And in that mysterious silence spreading even to the youngest Marines, the balance of the story began shifting toward its rightful owner, opening the path for the revelation that was about to break open. Heavy engine noise rumbled from a distance, quickly drawing closer, making the ground beneath the young Marine's boots tremble. A convoy of black military SUVs lined up in a long formation sped into the shooting range with a force no one could process fast enough. Behind them, military police vehicles flashed their rotating lights, but kept their sirens silent, as if the situation was too urgent to waste even the sound. Overhead, the rotor blades of a descending helicopter sent waves of dust rolling across the range. The entire shooting line froze. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Phones hovered in mid-air. Everyone stood still as if time had snapped. Thorne was the first to understand something was wrong. His face drained of color in a single breath. He stumbled half a step back, eyes darting the moment he recognized the high-level insignias on the vehicles. The door of the leading SUV swung open. A colonel from Quantico stepped out. His hair was snow-white. His uniform was so perfectly pressed that not a single crease appeared out of place. But what silenced the entire range wasn't the rank, it was his expression. The expression of a man who had witnessed far more than most humans are built to endure. He did not scan the surroundings. He looked straight at Walter Briggs, still lying calmly behind the M40A6. He walked toward Walter, not fast, but with absolute certainty. The officers behind him kept the proper distance, trailing a man they owed a lifetime of respect without ever having met him. When he stopped in front of Walter, the colonel stood tall heels, striking the ground with purpose. Then he raised his right hand in a salute, not the rigid, formal kind taught in manuals, but one carrying reverence. The kind of salute only men who survived because of each other truly understand. "It's an honor, Mr. Briggs." His voice was low, but it carried across the entire range. Not a single Marine failed to feel their spine tighten. No one had ever heard a senior officer call a man in janitor's clothing Mr., and certainly never with the word honor attached to it. Right behind him, the base commander approached and stopped by his side. He said nothing. He simply lifted his hand in a sharp, flawless salute. Then another officer did, and another. Then the entire group behind them. They saluted together toward the thin, elderly veteran with his hand resting on the rifle. Phones that had been raised moments earlier, ready to record a humiliating joke, now slowly lowered one by one. Young Marines stood frozen, as if their breath had been squeezed out. The laughter that had filled the air earlier vanished entirely, leaving behind a silence so dense it seemed to swallow the sound of sand slipping from someone's pant cuff. Walter slowly lifted his head. His aged eyes met the colonel's. There was no pride there, no fear. Only the calm of a man who understood that sometimes the past returns not to punish, but to remind. Thorne stood beside him like a statue. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Only one question echoed violently inside his mind, a question he didn't dare speak aloud. What have I done? The wind shifted. A small metal sign at the edge of the range rattled softly, as if tapping out a rhythm to mark the moment power changed hands. Everyone sensed it. This was no longer about respect. It was far beyond that. A legend had just stepped into the frame of their lives without taking a single step. And that reverence was only the beginning, a precursor to the truth that was about to be spoken aloud in the moments ahead. The colonel stood before Walter, lowering his salute, then turned to face the entire recon sniper platoon. His voice was deep resonant and sharp-honed by a lifetime molded in the discipline of the Marine Corps. This man saved more Marines than your entire platoon combined. The words struck the frozen air like a hammer blow. A private swallowed hard without meaning to. A corporal dropped his phone onto the dirt but didn't even notice. No one dared move, not a step. They heard every word clearly, so clearly, it felt as if their skin had been torn open to force the truth inside. The colonel continued without needing notes, because he never forgot the names he owed. He is the ghost of Quiet Ridge. The man who held off an entire enemy battalion for 72 hours. A Navy Cross, 2 Silver Stars, 3 Purple Hearts. A few of the younger Marines nearest him went utterly still. Those were no longer medals they had only read about. Those were medals they knew paid for in real blood. Paid for by real friends. Paid for by names that sometimes never even made it onto a headstone. A sergeant whispered, trying to keep his voice steady, though it trembled anyway. Sir, you mean him? The colonel turned and looked straight at him. Yes, Sergeant. Him. The man you were mocking. The man you thought only knew how to hold a broom. No one said another word. No one dared object. No one had the courage to look Walter directly in the eyes, because they knew those eyes had seen things they were not yet old enough to comprehend. Walter remained still, one hand resting lightly on the old leather sling. No pride, no anger, no justification. Only a quietness so profound it made everyone feel smaller in his presence. He didn't need medals. He didn't need applause. He didn't need to explain who he was. He had lived his entire life in silence, and now that very silence had become the strongest testimony. Thorne stood closest to him, his legs shaking as if he'd stepped onto ice. He bowed his head, unable to face the truth crashing down on him like a waterfall. His chest burned not from shame alone, but from the realization that he had mocked a man he wasn't worthy to speak lightly about. Sir. Thorne tried to speak, but his voice cracked like an overstretched cord. He couldn't continue. There were no words left that made sense. The colonel looked at Walter, then turned back to the platoon. If not for him, many of you wouldn't be here to laugh at anyone. No one replied. Silence wrapped around the entire range like a heavy cloak. Walter nodded slowly, not to accept praise, but simply to acknowledge he had heard. His eyes drifted beyond the shooting range as if he were seeing the faces of the young soldiers left behind in the jungles decades ago, men who weren't here to receive any thanks. A private drew a deep breath, gathering all the courage he had to ask the question. The entire platoon was too afraid to voice, Colonel. Is that really true? He did that alone. The colonel nodded gently. Alone, with one young spotter who was killed. Mr. Briggs finished the rest. No one dared breathe too loudly. A few young Marines stared at their boots as if that was the only way to escape the weight settling onto their shoulders. Walter stayed silent. His silence was no longer a shield hiding the past. It had become a thin veil covering the grief he had carried his entire life. And in that moment, something subtle shifted in the eyes of the young Marines. No more arrogance. No more superiority. Only respect, simple, honest, and heavy as a soldier's oath. And in that very moment, the real lesson began to take shape, a lesson only Walter could give to young men still struggling with the weight of the strength they carried. Thorne stood frozen. His lips trembled once, then pressed together. He tried to speak again, this time quieter, truer, stripped of every layer of arrogance he had worn earlier. "Sir, I... I didn't know." The words escaped him like the exhale of someone who had just come face to face with a truth bigger than himself. His arms hung at his sides, his shoulders slumped, and the pride he flaunted moments ago vanished as if it had never existed. The colonel from Quantico turned toward him, tilting his head slightly, ready to deliver another harsh reprimand, one Thorne deserved, and one he would have remembered for the rest of his life. But before he could speak, a deep, steady voice cut through the air. "He's just a young man with fire. The Corps needs that fire." Walter Briggs rose slowly from his firing position, his hand still resting lightly on the rifle. His voice carried no blame, no sarcasm, only the quiet truth of a man who had watched youth burn bright, brilliant, and then extinguish forever in jungles these young Marines had never walked. The colonel looked at Walter, and his gaze softened. Not because he excused Thorne, but because he understood only those who have brushed close to death know how to forgive with precision at the right moment to the right person. Walter bent down, his rugged hand resting on the old leather sling. He ran his fingers gently along the worn edges as though each crack and scratch were its own memory. A rifle is nothing without the man holding it, and the man beside him matters even more. No one spoke. Silence covered the range, letting those words sink into every uniform, every rank insignia, every breath. The young Marines weren't just hearing a lesson, they were hearing a legacy. Then the memory resurfaced. That young soldier, long ago face smeared with mud, smiling brightly, despite the jungle rain, stepped forward, handing Walter the leather sling with a proud, eager voice. "I traded my last pack of cigarettes for it. It's good. Your rifle won't slip." 2 days later, that same young soldier fell beneath the jungle canopy, while the leather sling became the only part of him that followed Walter through the rest of his life. The image appeared and dissolved like a ghost, fading into the earth's damp breath, leaving behind a quiet ache that words could never fully describe. When Walter opened his eyes, the memory slid back into its place, not gone, not healed, but no longer raw. It had simply settled as old wounds do. In front of him, Thorne inhaled deeply, gathering the remnants of courage inside him. Then he dropped to one knee, one hand on his thigh, his head bowed low. "Sir, I'm sorry." It wasn't an apology to escape punishment. It was the apology of a soldier who finally understood he had disrespected something sacred, something far beyond any weapon in his platoon. Walter looked at him. Not for long, not to judge, just long enough to see the genuine remorse trembling in the young man's eyes. He nodded slow, steady, a gesture of forgiveness. Thorne exhaled shakily, as if being pulled back from a deep pit he had thrown himself into. The wind swept lightly across the range, carrying a thin veil of dust between two generations, a space now bridged by the nod of a man who had lived long enough to know that sometimes forgiveness is stronger than punishment. And from that moment, something larger began to take shape, because forgiveness is not the end of anything. It is the door that allows a legacy to continue. In the days following the incident at Stone Bay, that shooting range was no longer a place of meaningless drills or arrogant laughter. The video recorded on the phones, originally meant to mock Walter Briggs, was sent directly to the Marine Corps Training Division. It was no longer a clip for entertainment, but a required lesson in the Corps' ethics curriculum. In classrooms, young recruits watched intently as Walter lifted the M40A6 like he was holding a piece of the past, and they watched the moment Thorne bowed his head in shame. No one watched it without feeling their throat tighten. Camp Campbellton issued new regulations as well. Metal plaques were erected at every shooting range engraved with a short line that carried immense weight. Respecting veterans is not optional, it is a duty. Every Marine walking past had to look at it before stepping into the training grounds. Some older sergeants stood before the sign for a few extra seconds, silent, as if remembering the men they had once served beside. As for Thorne's platoon, the same faces that had laughed loudly that afternoon, they were all reduced in rank. They were assigned 1 month of service at the local Veterans Hall. They swept the floors, arranged chairs for meetings, listened to stories they never thought they would ever hear. The elderly veterans looked at them with eyes both kind and tired, the eyes of men who understood that youth, no matter how proud, must eventually learn how to grow up. After 1 month, not a single Marine in that platoon laughed the way they once did. Weeks passed. One misty morning, Walter Briggs returned to Stone Bay. He held his broom, as he always did. Each motion was light, steady, like he was sweeping away the bits of dust that people tend to overlook in the larger picture of life. The range was quiet, broken only by the faint shuffle of sand beneath his boots. Footsteps approached from behind. Not the sharp strides of officers, nor the hurried shuffling of recruits. Slow, yet carrying determination, Thorne appeared. He carried no rifle, no symbols of authority. Only 2 cups of hot coffee steam drifting gently in the morning air. He stood a few steps from Walter, not daring to move too close, but not stepping back as he once did. He held out a cup with both hands, as if offering the apology he could not fully express in words. "Thank you for not giving up on me." His voice softened, careful not to disturb the quiet peace Walter carried with him. His eyes held gratitude, and something deeper, a silent vow he had just made to himself. Walter accepted the coffee. His fingers brushed Thorne's hand just enough for the young Marine to feel the warmth of a man he once thought was just an old janitor. Walter met his eyes, the gaze gentle but firm. "Learn where to aim your fire, son. No lecture, no reprimand. Just one short sentence, but a sentence every soldier should hear at least once in their life." They stood side by side. No more words, both looking out across the range as dawn slowly brightened the horizon. One man had lived long enough to need nothing more. One man was learning how to carry the weight of responsibility. That moment was seen by no one, but it was enough to change the course of a soldier's life. And as the sun rose above the horizon, a light breeze carried a familiar feeling, the sense that those who had fallen, the young soldier who once handed Walter that leather sling, were still somewhere nearby, watching smiling. Brave veteran stories. We remember the quiet heroes. If this story makes you believe that honor and kindness never retire, please share this video, and subscribe to Brave Veteran Stories so that none of their memories are ever forgotten.